Thanks for joining us. Today, we're talking about one of the most human, most feared, and most sacred parts of life death and dying. I'm joined by Chris Ehrlich, a spiritual counselor from hospice, to help us better understand hospice care, the emotional and spiritual journey at the end of life, and what the dying can teach the living. Welcome, Chris, and thanks for being here. To begin, can you give the audience your background? How did you get started as a spiritual counselor, and how much experience have you had in hospice?
Hey, Vienna. Yes, thank you. And that journey began back when I think I've always been fascinated with the idea of death and dying. My mother passed away when I was 6 years old. So it's always been on my mind. And I started with going to seminary because I thought being a pastor would be um, a place that was a good place calling for me. But then I moved out of that. I did that for 15 years and started my board certification process, became a professional chaplain. And I've been doing between hospital and hospice. I've been doing that work about 18 years. That's a quick broad brush of how that all got started, but that's pretty much, I guess, the Reader's Digest version of my career history.
So, you've had a lot of experience with spiritual counseling and pastoring. For the people who don't know what hospice is, can you explain what hospice is?
Hospice is a place where people go when their primary physician or specialist would tell them that there's absolutely nothing else that they could do. Our goal in hospice, because it has had a very negative impact on our culture, and I'm not real sure why that is, but we're not the people that help people die. We're the people that want to give those who face end of life a quality of life for as long as they have left on this earth. For instance, a quality of life would be not having pain, managing their anxiety, and also working with the families who walk with them. So that looks like, yeah, we do administer morphine to help people with pain and whatnot, and other opioids that help with anxiety and that sort of thing. My part is the spiritual part to help people. They might have some unfinished business. They might have a lot of anxiety about what's next. They might have a lot of shame and guilt. And sometimes a spiritual care counselor can go in and find out all kind of things about a person because we held that sacred space for the patient and the family. So, in other words, in my charting, I don't necessarily put everything that we talk about. It's only what the team might need. And the team consists of nurse, doctor, social worker. If they want a chaplain is involved, and of course, CNA and that kind of thing. So, as far as what hospice is, it is a organization that helps people find comfort and meaning in a lot of ways because we do control their pain, and once end of life does come, we make them as comfortable as they possibly can.
And is hospice free? Or do you have to pay for that service?
It is free. There are some for-profit hospice. So if anybody's listening, if you're looking for a hospice, be aware of, or the question maybe you should ask is this a for-profit hospice? But most hospices are nonprofit. We get 95% of our funding from Medicare.
Well, that's good to know. I didn't know that hospice was free or that it was funded by Medicare. And how is hospice different from palliative care or traditional medical treatment?
Palliative care and home care treatment. Palliative care means that that is a chronic illness that you will be living with the rest of your life. And so a lot of hospices now are joining palliative care. So you'll hear some hospices say hospice and palliative care. And we're trying, and the current hospice that I'm in, we're trying to put that together where we can also see palliative care patients that are outside of hospice. And it's kind of, then they would graduate on into hospice care. But basically, just the meaning is simply chronic illness. This is a person that doesn't necessarily need the level of care that hospice gives, but they still need a level of care because they're dealing with a chronic illness, and a lot of times pain is involved with that.
And what exactly is your role as a spiritual counselor for hospice? What do you do?
What I do is I usually do homes. So I go into people's homes and we will, I'll introduce myself and do an initial spiritual assessment. And that initial spiritual assessment, I'll find out what kind of support they have. Do they have, if they're Christocentric, do they have a church? If they're Buddhist, do they have a temple? Or do they have imam if they're Islam? But my basic role is to help people find meaning. And the greatest tool that I use is when I go into a visit, I don't have an agenda. I let the patient tell me what that agenda is. And of course, I will make regular visits. Sometimes I'll go once a month. Sometimes I'll go with other patients. I'll go 2 times a month. It just depends on their level of care that they need. And I help them with unfinished business. And sometimes I bring my guitar and just play music because sometimes it's just about companionship and fellowship that people need. They might be homebound and can't get to church. So I'll bring my guitar and play some old hymns for them. And some of them even like a little bit of rock and roll, or folk music or country music. And if I can play it, I'll certainly do it for them. But and this is the quality of life. If you can't go to church or you can't go hear your favorite artist, if I can provide something for you that'll give you some sense of meaning in your life, then I'll do my best to do that.
Do they ask for requests, like certain songs?
Oh yeah,
What
yeah, yeah. They do.
where are the most requested songs?
Well, and the age group that I'm working with, a lot of times they want me to play Elvis Presley, and I'm like, well, acoustic guitar and Elvis Presley is not the best thing, but I was doing Johnny Cash, and I did do Hotel California for a patient, and there was one time, I was thinking out loud when I was looking at my prompter, and I said, "Oh no, I can't sing that song." He said, "Well, what song was it?" And I was like, "You really don't want to know." And he's like, "No, really, tell me what it is." I said, "Well, it's knocking on heaven's door." And he said, "I love that song. Play it for me."
Well, you would think that would be the most requested song. That's funny.
I'm like, I know. I was like, I don't want to like push that on you, but yeah, at least thank goodness it wasn't Bat Out of Hell from Meatloaf, right?
Well, hey, you never know. Somebody might be requesting that, so you probably
Somebody
should
might. I
learn
don't
the
think I can
lyrics.
play it though.
How do you support people with different faiths, beliefs, or no religious background at all if they're atheists?
Well, if it's a person who has a different faith background, like let's say Islam or Buddhist, and they need their spiritual leader, like an imam or a monk, we have resources to contact, to get that person what they need, because obviously I wouldn't be able to do some of the ceremonies and rituals. So we have that. And I do have quite a few atheists who have asked for chaplain. And basically, what I do with them is just like I said earlier, I never go in to any home and assume that just because a person asks for a chaplain that they're Christocentric. I go in with no agenda of any religion. And then I will ask them, do you have are you a person of faith? And if they say no, then I said, well, tell me how I can best help you. How can I support you and serve you? And most of the time they'll say, I just really want somebody to listen to, somebody I can talk to. And I remember I was at a hospice home and there was a patient, he had a great big long beard, and he didn't want me to be there, but his sister did, because I think his sister wanted me to save his soul, which is not what we do in hospice or as a chaplain, unless somebody specifically asked for that. And so we got to talking and we both found out we liked sunrises and sunsets. And I did a lot of photography and I was showing him some pictures. And he told me a story about a friend of his who was sitting on the porch and he was like, it was like, you know, 6 o'clock in the morning. And his friend said, "Well, what are we doing here?" He said, "We're waiting for the sunrise." And the guy said, "Well, that's stupid." And he said, he looked over at him. He's just this real mountainy kind of guy. He's like, "Well, you're a effing idiot." And I belly laughed so hard. And he started laughing. He was like, "You can come back." But I met him where he was. And the reason for bringing that story is with any patient, including atheist, I meet them where they are. And a chaplain, a spiritual care provider, should never have a judgment. If they do, they don't belong in the business.
What spiritual questions come up most often for people who are dying?
It's a good question. Most questions, I never really had anybody ask me what's beyond. The biggest question is not a question. I don't get a lot of questions, but what I do get is um, fear. And a lot of times I have to ask the question because sometimes people, especially with a person, spiritual care counselor or a chaplain, they equate us with pastor. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time to get there. Like, for instance, again, at the hospice home, there was a fella that I held his hand until he died. They called me. It was early in the morning, and I was there on campus, and I went over, and he had COPD, and he couldn't barely talk. I could tell, obviously, he was very frightened. And his question would be, uh, probably if he asked it, I'm scared, and how do I get forgiveness? Because I asked him the questions and I said, "Don't try to talk," because he was really struggling. I said, "I'm going to ask you some questions." I said, "Are you a person of faith?" He shook his head, yes. And I said, "Are you afraid?" He shook his head, yes. And I said, "Are there some things that you need forgiveness for?" And he shook his head, yes. So I said, "I'm going to name a few denominations and you tell me which one you are." I said, "Methodist, you know, on down." And I got to Baptist and he shook his head, yes. I said, "Well, in Baptist, because in Baptist faith, you believe that if you ask forgiveness from God, then you're forgiven." And so I reiterated that to him. And I said, "The only person here that condemns you is you." And I said, "You need to let this go. You need to know that you're forgiven." And he started to calm down. The nurse said his blood pressure was going down, and I was just talking to him. And I said, "I won't go anywhere." I said, "I'll hold your hand to the very end." And I knew it wouldn't be long. And so he would wake up every once in a while or get really. I said, "You're okay." Um, and I did. I held his hand until he took his last breath, and I believe he died peacefully. So the questions are not necessary. I don't get a whole lot of questions. A lot of times, what I have to do is kind of fish that out. And that's an interesting question that you asked because I had to think for a moment. Well, what kind of questions do I get? And I really don't get a whole lot of questions, but I do get, and this is the work, my work that I have to do in the team is I have to kind of look for it. I have to listen. And listening is not always with your ears, it's with your eyes, body language, emotional responses. And so, yeah, I don't get a lot of questions, but with spiritual care counseling, you have to, a lot of times it's taking risks, and I've asked questions before and they're like, "Oh no, you're so totally off," but, and then that's okay because I certainly don't want to be going down a subject or a rabbit hole with someone that is not going to benefit them. But for this person, it did. And so I hope that answered the question about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, what besides guilt do people have at the end of life? Like, what common themes have you noticed at the end of life?
I think for the most part, everybody does not want to suffer. And what I mean by suffering is pain. Pain is, there's levels of pain I hope I never experience. And I think that is the greatest expression of, my hospice patients. The other is just the natural fear of dying. But that is the second biggest. And it doesn't mean that you're not a person of faith because and one of the things that I tell most of my patients, I said, it is absolutely normal for you to feel fear. I said, and I can't sit here and tell you what you're going through because I'm not there yet. But, and of course, if they're Christian, I can fall back on the Jesus story. And, in the gospels, Jesus is very afraid to die. My God, why have you forsaken me? He's in the Garden of Gethsemane and said he dropped sweat as if they were large drops of blood. That's fear. And so, I think that the biggest expression is I'm about to go on a journey. I don't know what's on the other side.
I believe everyone, well, maybe not everyone. I know I'm afraid of death, but most people are afraid of death because it's the unknown.
Yeah, that's what I normally get.
So what advice do you have for people who have this major fear of dying? Because everyone's going to die. You can't escape death.
So when I know someone who is just absolutely petrified and afraid, that's when I start doing work of, are you good with yourself? What is there unfinished business with loved ones? Because a lot of times that fear has to do with shame and guilt. And guilt, I'm not so necessarily worried about, but shame is huge because shame is something that sticks. Guilt, give it a little bit of time and you'll wind up coming out okay. But shame, it has to do with, I mean, it's really a very deep, it's either a wound or it's come out of a wound. And those are the kind of things that I try to work with people on because for us who are not facing end of life, get your stuff together, find your peace, make things right with the people that you have wronged, and try to make things right with the people that have wronged you because it will come back. That is the number one biggest issue that I have with people who are facing end of life. And because you cannot find peace if you have all of this um, baggage. And I've found that there's a lot of good tools in Buddhism that help with that. And the not the doctrinal story of Jesus, but the real actual gospel story of Jesus, and things, sayings like, why worry about tomorrow when today has enough of its own? These are the kind of things that we work on in hospice because people hold on to things and, I have no tool to let them know how to let go of it. Hopefully through conversation and a little bit of counseling on my end for spiritual care, people will be able to hold on to that and find their peace. It still doesn't take you away the sting of being afraid to die, but it helps because if you've got all this shame and you're going to face end of life, then you're definitely going to be afraid to die. And I will say this on this subject: most of the time, people die the way they want to. Some people die. I just had a patient who died. She was peaceful when she passed, but she held on so long. I felt like was making a penance, um, without getting into her story. And I've had a few patients like that who feel like they deserve that pain. They deserve that guilt and shame. And my job is to maybe help relieve that a little bit.
Besides having that guilt and shame and asking for forgiveness from others and forgiving others, what else has the end of life taught people? What are people's biggest regrets at the end of life?
I think the biggest thing that people regret is not living in the moment. So, in other words, not living, what their heart craves. So, I want to go see the Grand Canyon, we'll go see the Grand Canyon. Don't wait because you don't know. I mean, people's lives change in a second.
Right. There are so many people that I know who don't want to enjoy life until, there are people who say, I will be happy when dot, dot, dot.
Right.
I'll be happy when I make $1 million, or I'll be happy when I become president of whatever, or I'll be happy when I'm 65 and retired. I think that people should not wait for a future time period and, like you said, live in the moment because you never know when your time is up. It can be tomorrow, it can be
That's right.
20 years from now or 50 years from now, nobody knows. So to say that you're gonna be happy when in the future, that time may never come.
And I'm glad you said that because, one of the things, that I enjoy out of the Jesus story and Gautama story is they were present, completely present. Nothing owned them. The man never, hardly had a place to live. Uh, didn't work. I mean, he worked, I guess, as a traveling evangelist, maybe. But where he went, he had food. Where he went, he had shelter. He didn't worry about those things. What I mean by being totally present is he was able, with the freedom of possessions didn't own him, politics didn't own him, power did not own him. Um, and to make things like, if your brother takes your shirt, offer him your cloak too. That's a freedom that, I mean, it's like, well, you're not getting that too. If it was me, I'd probably be like, oh, you stole my shirt. You ain't getting nothing else. Um, because I own that. And I think part of the way that we are free, just totally free, is that whole idea of just letting go. And that's really frightening. But I think when you face end of life, you can't take those millions
Mhm.
with you. You can't take, the Mercedes or the, all the houses and all the fame and what does it mean but with your credentials? Everything falls away. When Jesus has stuff like, you know, the kingdom of heaven is at hand, you don't have to wait to let go until when you die. And I'm not saying that everybody should become, just quit your job and don't do this, and sell your homes and all that stuff. The point is owning inside, people, you see this all the time with people who have lose their home in a fire or they, some kind of catastrophe. Um, they usually bounce back, and hopefully learn a lesson, um, because that's horrible. But the people who fare better with that are the people who say, and most people do, at least my son's alive or my wife is alive. I came out unscathed. That's not
Right.
letting the possessions that were destroyed own them. And that's very freeing.
Right. The older I get, the more I realize that it's not about material things. It's about the relationships that you have your loved ones and your friends and family who are in your life. So, what has being close to death taught you personally about how to live?
I think that you have to embrace the fact that you're going to end this cycle, that this life that you're living, if when we have the perspective that we're going to die, it's the whole memento mori idea of don't forget you have to die. You cannot embrace life. And in our culture right now, it just seems like everybody's trying to run away from death. Um, and not that you need to necessarily run toward it, but you do have to accept it. We want to look younger. Um, uh, I've been having, as I've gotten older, I have these ads now come up on my Facebook about these 60-year-old men who have, six packs and they look like they're, some kind of Amazon warrior, and strutting around with their shirts off. And I'm like, what happened to the beauty of age? And so I see all of this and we spend billions of dollars trying to look young. Um, I think that's because people are afraid and don't want to embrace the fact that they're going to die one day.
Absolutely. I mean, like I said before, I'm afraid of death. Even though I believe in an afterlife and reincarnation, I still have that fear of death. And I think a lot of people also don't want to get old.
Well,
There's a lot of issues with being older. You know, your joints get stiffened, and some people have a hard time walking or even taking care of themselves or going to the bathroom. I can understand why some people want to try to stay young, but at the same time, you can't fight death. You know, death is inevitable.
I think, what you do, I mean, there's a lot of things that we do that hurt our bodies. And there's some things you just can't help. But I do know that because I'm 63, and you're right, your joints do start to hurt. But there's things that you could do to prevent that or at least help with it. But I was thinking just the other day, would I give my young self, if I had the choice, the peace and wisdom and the being present? I don't think I would because moving forward, yes, there's going to be a time when that happens if I live that long. But then there's a beauty in that too. The beauty of that is being free to allow the people that you love to care for you. Most of the time, the people that I deal with, they're all concerned about that and are like, well, I'm a burden, I'm this, I'm that, and all this other stuff. And I said, your daughter wouldn't be doing this if she didn't love you. This isn't an obligation. This is a love. And it is hard to take care of someone. But those relationships during that time are rich. I mean, you couldn't get gold to replace the value of those relationships. One of my favorite things to do when I go to a home is I get to hear the stories, you know, and there's this one guy, um, he's a Korean veteran and, one of the only ones, but boy, he sure is telling me all the stuff that happened and all this things. I was like, golly, this is a treasure, you know, just to hear his stories. And then I can apply some of those stories to my story.
What advice can you give to people who have a loved one who is dying or in hospice care?
I think the biggest advice that I can give is that person is not leaving you. In the Hindu culture, that person is simply dropping their body. The love that you have and the energy, because I believe that energy is more about God, if I have to put a term on it. But that energy, we are energy. And what's inside of us, our essence, if you will, when you connect with another person, that's forever. You don't ever lose that. Now, I can't give you answers about, oh, well, does people know each other in heaven? And, and all that stuff. I don't know, but I do know that those people, I mean, just in my own experience with people that I have lost, those people are still with me. And I think the advice is try not to see them as gone or going, but see them as gone and going from my sight, not within.
So the first law of thermodynamics is that energy cannot be created nor destroyed. And that's how I feel about our spirit, that our soul cannot be created or destroyed.
Absolutely. I totally agree with that. And, in if you don't mind, I mean, I can share a story, and it's from my grandmother. My grandmother and I were very close, and I was in my undergraduate work, very very present to not owning anything, just working day to day to eat, study, and didn't have a car. And being in Louisiana, I was up at the top of the boot in Shreveport, and my grandmother was down near New Orleans, near the Baton Rouge area. And it's a very long drive. And they had found a bleed and she wasn't going to survive it. And I knew it would be soon and I couldn't go. I didn't even have enough money for a bus fare. And so we talked that evening as best she could. And I told her I loved her and went to bed that evening after my studies. And I woke up straight up at 11:30, looked at the clock, something was in my room, and it scared me to death. I was about to run out of my duplex because it was that present. And so one of the things that I remember when I was with my grandmother is she was kind of an eccentric person. And she loved Jesus Loves Me, This I Know. And I was like, Grandma, that's a child song. And why do you like that song? I said, "Gah," just giving her a hard time. Well, that song rang in my ears like it was on the radio. I mean, it was so loud in my head. And then all of a sudden, a calmness just settled over me. And I said, Grandma. My dad called me 15 minutes later and told me she had died at 11:30.
Wow. So that was the time that your grandmother passed away and she came to you right then.
She came to me because she knew me so well. She knew that I would hold a lot of regret about not being able to get down there to see her. And I believe she's still with me. And that's energy. Her energy was there. And I don't care doctors, I don't psychiatry, I don't care. That was real, And for people who are losing someone or about to lose someone, just keep in mind that they're not gone. They're just dropping their body, they're still around.
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing that story. I think that gives people comfort knowing that their loved ones really don't just become extinct when their body
Yeah.
dies. Do you have any memorable stories of people on their deathbed and who have passed?
You mean, that I've
For
witnessed?
instance, Steve Jobs, when he passed on his deathbed, right at the moment that he passed, he uttered something on the lines of, "Wow, that's beautiful. It's so
Mm.
beautiful." I think because he was seeing heaven when he was passing. Did you have any stories like that?
Well, there is a story. This is a this is a funny story. I think it's a funny story. It's beautiful. I had a patient who his grandson was telling me, and I had gone to see him, and this man, he was at peace with himself and everything. And he believed he's Christocentric and he believed wholeheartedly where he was going. And so when he passed away, I did a bereavement visit to the family, and his grandson said, they always call me pastor. I wish they wouldn't, but they do. They said, Pastor Chris, I was there when grandpa died. And he looked up and he said, look, son, there's Jesus coming to take me home. He said, come on, let's go. He said, Pastor, I drew my hand away and said, Grandpa, I ain't ready to go yet. But the fact that he saw that. I've seen people smile. I've seen people ask for forgiveness. The only sad part that that does for me is that tells me that you waited until the end for that moment. I can't even begin to tell you or even want to try to talk about heaven. That's a concept. Just like it's like talking about God. You could talk about God through Mohammed, Jesus, Buddha. You could talk about him through a human form, but God is so big. How could you? That's impossible. There's a movie that I think everybody should watch. It's called Secondhand Lions. And there's a part where Hub, played by Deval, what's his name? He just died not too long ago. But anyway, he's telling this young man who had all these visions of him from his other uncle who told the stories. And of course, the movie goes about, this child's view of this great man and all the feats that he did. And he was asking him a question one night, um, and Hub was the character's name. He said, "If you want to believe in something, believe in it. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. What matters is that you love, and that love is strong and faithful." And I thought, man, that is one of the best theological statements in a movie. It doesn't matter what we believe. Our intention is the most important. Um, And I think the people who die the most peaceful are the people who have those intentions, the best intentions, and they believe in something. What happens beyond that, I'll let you know if I can come back and tell you, you know. But I think the beauty of death is, and this is the whole thing: live life. Life, there's no tomorrow. Because don't forget, you have to die. But also, don't forget that you have to live.
I keep thinking about death and memento mori, and I'm also reading a book that's it's not titled Memento Mori, but it's about memento mori. And we should actually do a separate another podcast episode about memento mori. And I know you're reading a book about that as well, so we can have like a separate episode and discussion about memento mori. But I've been thinking about death a lot because I'm middle aged and I know that time is running out for me. I don't know how much time I have left. Nobody knows. But I think that like people who are younger, I know in my 20s, I didn't think about death
Mhm.
a lot. Like I rarely thought about death. I think people who are younger think that they're immortal, that they're never going to die until you get to around our age when we know, oh my gosh, we're going to kick the bucket soon. It doesn't mean that like you said, it doesn't mean that you should be living every single day like you're dying and spending all your savings and,
Mhm.
living recklessly. But you should also learn how to live, living your life fully and not waiting until a certain time in the future where you think that you're going to be happy. I don't know if it's Confucius, but I know it's a Japanese saying that
Mhm.
there is no past, there's no future, the only time is the present.
And you're absolutely right. And I do think this younger generation is on to something because I'm constantly hearing about meditation, constantly hearing about being present and being present where we really find our peace. Now, don't get me wrong, I've never lost a child. Um, I've sat with a lot of people who have, and that's horrible. That is probably one of the worst. And so when I say be present, don't let anything own you, we can have things. It's just when they're gone, and I'm talking material things. And I think when tragedy hits is when that really comes. What's more important? What is the most important thing? I have my health still. Houses can be rebuilt. You know, most of the time people in your community come together during those things, it's it's a peacefulness when, okay, this is awful, this is sad, but these things don't own me. And I think the way that we approach end of life, or that would be a more peaceful way of approaching end of life, is if we work toward that goal. And that doesn't mean, I mean, what it means is just, making peace with you. There's a Buddhist story about a girl who lost a baby. Well, she couldn't accept that the baby was gone. So she went to all her neighbors and tried to ask them, "Can you heal my baby? Can you heal my baby?" She went to the local doc, the town doctor, and then went to the temple. And the monk there said, "Well, the Dalai Lama is on top of that mountain. He can do what you ask." So she went up to the top of the mountain and she asked the Dalai Lama if he could heal her baby, and he said, "I can do what you ask. But I need you to go back to the village and I need you to collect thyme, the herb thyme. But you can only collect thyme from a house where death hasn't touched." So she went back down to the village and every house could not give her thyme because everybody has experienced um, death of somebody, some sort in their lives. And so she went back up the mountain and the Dalai Lama asked her, "Did you get the time?" She said, "No, but I think I can bury my baby now." And the beauty of that is the other part of death and dying is the community. If you're facing it or you're going through it, there's other people that have gone through it too. And I think a good book that talks about a lot of that is the Book of Joy. Suffering is a part of life, just like death, and living is a part of life. But when we share and we come together as a community, it takes that sting away. Just like this lady in the story, um, she could not accept the fact that her baby was gone. But when she knew that other people went through the same thing, then she could accept it because she had a whole community of people that she could lean on to help her get through that grief.
Like I've said before, death is inescapable. Everybody is going to die and has experienced somebody who has died. I had a friend that passed away a few weeks ago in a tragic car accident. He was young, he was in his 30s, and they
Yeah.
set up a GoFundMe page for him to help pay for his funeral and other costs. And I was so touched to see how many people donated money and left wonderful, heartfelt comments on the page. They were able to raise over $20,000 to help pay for the costs, and I can't believe I could believe how wonderful the community rallied to help this family that was going through this tragedy.
Well, and I think that's part of some of the things that I get to see in my work. But, in telling that story, I wonder how many of those people had different political views. How many of those people might have been, some of them might have been atheists, some of them might have been Christians, some of them could have been Buddhist or Islam or, Wiccan or whatever. And how many of that? But when I think one of the beauties of death and dying is the community does come together and all these other things really don't matter, and I think that's beautiful. So that could be a beautiful take on death. It's a mystery. And just this young man, he probably never thought that the day that he got up and drank coffee, got in his car, would be the last day of his life here on this earth. And he's present. I
Yeah.
see it, when people at the end, they're usually unresponsive. And I continuously tell the families and people who are close to them, you tell them, talk to them just like you always do. Because I believe, and you can see it in body language. They know you're there. on some level, they can hear everything that's going on. Um, this shell, this vessel that we use as our bodies that house us, it's limited. But as you said, energy is um, is indestructible. How do you get rid of that?
We're nearing the end of the podcast now. What final message would you want the audience to take away about death, dying, and living fully?
Make peace. Make peace with yourself. Um, make peace with your family. Because when we're young, we can go around and say, I'm done. You know, and I'm talking mostly to family. Those things tend to come back. And that's not the time that you need to be dealing with that. Deal with it. You know, it's okay to be angry. And I know there are some horrific things that some people have done to other people. You don't have to be okay with what happened. There's a song, and I forgot who sings it, but it's called I'm Not What is it? Anyway, the lyrics talk about I'm not the event. I'm not the fall. I'm not the pain. I choose to be who I am. I'm not what happened to me. That's it. That's the name of the song. I'm not I'm not what happened to me. And I think that's powerful because you can forgive, and there's a thing in Christianity that says, oh, the Lord forgives and forgets. And I'm like, no, that's not true. You never forget. And theologically, that's just not even a logical statement because if God doesn't know something and you do, then you know something more than God does. So it's okay to not appreciate what happened, but there is a place of forgiveness because it will come back. And, and that's the unfinished business. If there's anything from this podcast is take care of your house because you and you're loved. It's just absorbs energy and it's easier to forgive and it takes less energy than it does to sit and be bitter and angry and hate.
Holding on to bitterness is like taking poison and you're hurting yourself. You're not really hurting the other person.
Well, absolutely. Absolutely. And for the Christocentric people, you go back to the Cain and Abel story. Cain decided that he wanted to give, he had like produce and he give produce. Abel had sheep. And so Abel would offer, a lamb and God favored Abel's sacrifice over Cain. Why? Doesn't say, doesn't matter. We try to put a lot of, that's not the point. We always try to put things in there that we don't understand. It doesn't matter. The point of the story is it doesn't matter why God chose one or the other. But what was the big thing is God came to Cain and said, why are you upset? You need to take care of this because it will devour you like a lion. And that's what hate does. It changes us. And you can see it all through history. Great men have done horrible things because of something that was done to them. And my thing is with anybody who's listening, you have to find that peace. Doesn't mean that you have to accept and say, oh, this is okay. You know, it's not okay, but you have to deal with what you're feeling inside and to hate someone. That's a lot of energy waste.
Well, thanks so much, Chris, for joining us in this podcast. Thanks so much for your time. How can people find you? I know that you say that you just created your own YouTube channel.
I did. It's called the Good Grief Coach. And I've set up teams for people who want to, who might need to talk. And I'm going to try to post something every day, but my email is thegoodgriefcoach@gmail.com. And we'll see how that goes. But every day, it's not always going to be about doom, nothing doom and gloom, but it might be a reading. It might be a song, but it's designed to help people as they go through the process. One of the best books on grief I've ever read, and it's not a book on grief. It's called Transitions, and we used it in my training for chaplaincy. Death and dying and loss and grief is not just about dying. You lose a limb, that's a loss. That's a death in and of itself. You lose your job, your dog dies, or your cat, or whatever. Divorce. All of these things are all grief and deal with loss. And so he was doing this book on, he would go into hospitals, and hospitals, they get taken over by another hospital. And if you've ever worked in a hospital, those of you who listen, you know what I'm talking about. Well, I ain't going to do that. I'm not going to do the way they want us to, because this is the way we've been doing it for 25 years. And they think they're going to come in, but that's all fear and grief. And he said, the thing about it's not the end that gets you, it's the transition. So moving from here to here is the difference. And that is grief. That's the whole road of grief. You could lose a job, you could lose your health, I mean, all those things. I'll be bringing up a lot of those topics in my little YouTube page and with resources.
Well, thanks so much, Chris. We look forward to seeing your videos on the YouTube channel. I'm going to post the link to your YouTube channel and your email in the description for the podcast or the video. And I just want to end our conversation by reminding everyone that death is not just about loss. It could also be a teacher, a mirror, and a call to live more honestly, love more deeply, and be more present while we still have the opportunity. If you can do me a huge favor and hit that subscribe button, share this video or podcast with a loved one who you think will find beneficial to listening to it. Thanks again for joining us. Namaste.